All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving headfirst into the world of large language models.
That's right. LLMs in 2025, huh?
LLMs, the AI systems that can write and translate, compose music. I mean, it's mind-blowing stuff.
It really is.
Our mission today is to help you understand this crazy new AI landscape.
Yeah.
We'll be focusing on the key differences between open source and closed source models.
Right.
And we'll use DeepSeek and ChatGPT as our prime examples.
Good examples.
Sometimes I feel like we're living in a sci-fi movie, you know?
I know what you mean. What's fascinating to me, though, is how we've moved so quickly beyond the theoretical with AI.
Yeah.
These are tools people are using every single day, often without even realizing it.
Okay, so let's break down this whole open source thing.
Right.
With DeepSeek, the code is open.
It is?
And it's like a recipe. Anyone can adjust it.
Yeah.
Developers can modify it. They can improve it. And best of all, no licensing fees.
Yeah, that's a huge draw for a lot of companies.
I bet. Especially when you compare that to the cost of closed source options, right?
Absolutely. Organizations are finding real cost efficiency with these open source LLMs.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there was a case study recently about a startup,
Okay.
and they saved almost 70% on development costs just by using DeepSeek.
70%. That's wild. But it's not all about the money, right?
Oh, no, not at all.
There's this whole community aspect to open source that just feels different.
Yeah, you're right.
It's like a global network of developers, right?
Exactly. It's like a global brain constantly collaborating and pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Yeah.
This leads to some serious, rapid innovation, sometimes at a pace that commercial companies just can't match.
That's amazing.
And you know what? Consumers are starting to notice this. The 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer.
I've heard of it.
It showed a clear preference for AI developed with a high level of transparency.
Makes sense.
And that's kind of at the heart of open source, right?
Yeah, absolutely. People want to know what's going on behind the scenes, especially with something as powerful as AI. But can anyone really customize these open source models?
Yeah.
I mean, does it take a ton of technical expertise?
You know, that's a common misconception. With DeepSeek, you can actually tailor the model without needing to be a coding wizard.
Really?
Really. Think about it. Let's say you're a law firm, right?
Yeah.
And you're dealing with tons of these really complex documents.
Tons.
You could actually tweak DeepSeek to summarize those documents in a very specific way.
How so?
You could pull out key clauses, identify potential risks, things like that.
So it's like having an AI intern you can train for your specific needs.
Exactly.
That's amazing. But now let's look at the other side of the coin.
Okay.
The closed source models, like ChatGPT.
Right. So with ChatGPT, you get that really user-friendly experience.
Yeah.
Everything is sort of prepackaged and ready to go.
Yeah.
It's really appealing for companies that need AI solutions, but maybe don't have a big team of developers.
Yeah, I can see that.
Plus, they often have the backing of these really large corporations.
Right.
With tons of resources.
So that means excellent support.
Yes.
It sounds like choosing between a custom-built car and a reliable model from a well-known brand.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Both get you there, but the experience is totally different.
Exactly. You have different levels of control and involvement depending on what you choose.
Okay, so closed source has that plug-and-play appeal.
Yeah.
But what about security? People always say closed source is more secure, like a vault. Is that true?
You know, it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Okay.
It's true that in closed source models, the source code is protected.
Right.
But that doesn't automatically mean it's impenetrable.
Interesting.
Think of it this way. Even the most secure bank vault can be vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
It depends on the sophistication of the security, not just whether the code is visible or not.
So open doesn't automatically mean risky, and closed doesn't automatically mean safe.
Right. It's not that simple. Security is way more complex than that.
That's a great point. It really makes you think about those different layers of security and how they're managed in each model. Let's talk about customization again, though.
Okay.
If I'm using a closed source model, how much freedom do I have to actually change things?
So that's where closed source models sometimes run into a bit of a problem.
Okay.
They're great for ease of use.
Yeah.
But they often lack the deeper customization options that you find with open source.
Yeah.
Imagine like a research lab, okay?
Okay.
And they need to process some very specific scientific data.
Right.
They might find it really difficult to adapt a closed source LLM to their very specific needs.
So it's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly.
You're stuck with what the model can do out of the box, and that's it.
Pretty much. And for some organizations that need very bespoke solutions, that's a deal breaker.
I can see why. Okay, so we've got open source with its pros and cons and closed source with its own set of advantages and disadvantages. It's a classic trade-off situation, isn't it?
It is.
But are there any challenges that both models face?
Yeah, definitely. I think a key challenge for open source LLMs is often resources.
Okay.
They might not have the same level of consistent funding or development manpower.
Right, because they don't have that big corporation behind them.
Exactly. On the other hand, closed source models, they often grapple with a lack of transparency.
Right.
We don't always know what data they were trained on.
That's true.
We don't always know how they're making their decisions.
It's like trusting a black box to make important judgments.
Yeah, it kind of is.
So open source might be more transparent, but faces resource hurdles.
Right.
And closed source may have the resources, but lacks transparency.
Exactly. Two sides of the same coin.
It makes you think, what are the trade-offs we are willing to accept as these models become more and more integrated into our lives? That's a great question to ponder. And I think it leads us perfectly into part 2 of our deep dive.
It is a fascinating question. As these models get more sophisticated, it's like we're giving them the keys to the car.
Yeah.
But we're not always sure where they're going to drive us.
Okay, I like that analogy. But to bring it back to our main topic, does one type of model, open or closed, offer more transparency in terms of how they work?
That's a good question. I wish it was a simple answer. You see, with open source models like DeepSeek, you can actually access the underlying code.
Okay.
So theoretically, you can see exactly how the model's built and how it functions.
So more transparency with open source?
Potentially, yes. But it's not as straightforward as just having access to the code.
Okay.
It's like trying to understand a complex machine just by looking at a blueprint.
Yeah.
You might see all the parts, but understanding how those parts interact and the intricacies of their function takes a much deeper level of knowledge.
So it's like having the blueprint, but not knowing how to interpret it.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And we also have to remember that the code is only one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Open source models are trained on these massive data sets.
Yeah.
And these data sets can be just as influential as the code itself.
Okay.
Figuring out what data was used and how it was processed can be really, really tough.
So even with the code being open, there are still these layers of complexity that might obscure true transparency.
Exactly.
What about closed source models then? Are we completely in the dark?
It can certainly feel that way. With closed source models, like ChatGPT, the inner workings are essentially hidden from view.
Okay.
It's like watching a magic trick.
Yeah.
We see this amazing outcome, but the method, how it's done, remains a secret.
No blueprint A&D, no explanation of the trick.
Yeah, pretty much.
That sounds a little frustrating, honestly.
Yeah, and I understand that frustration. This lack of transparency can be a real concern.
Yeah.
Especially when you start to think about how the model might exhibit biases based on its training data.
Right.
If we don't know what data was used or how it was processed, it's really hard to assess the potential for biased outputs.
That makes sense. It's one thing to use these models for fun, creative tasks.
Yeah.
But using them for things like loan approvals or job applications,
Right.
where bias could have some really serious real-world consequences.
Exactly.
We need a different level of scrutiny there.
I completely agree. It really highlights the need for more conversation around responsible AI development.
Yeah.
And that's regardless of whether it's open or closed source.
So transparency is obviously super important.
Yeah.
But it's clearly pretty complex and not always easy to achieve.
Right.
So let's talk about control for a second.
Okay.
Do we, as users, have more control over open source models?
To some extent, yes.
Okay.
With open source models, you actually have the ability to directly modify the code.
Right.
Think of it like being able to tweak a recipe to create a dish that perfectly suits your taste.
Yeah.
You can adjust the parameters. You can experiment with different training data.
Yeah.
You can really shape the model to fit your specific needs.
That sounds pretty empowering. It's almost like being able to program your own personal AI assistant.
It is a lot like that.
Yeah.
But remember, with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Yeah.
Modifying an AI model requires a really deep understanding of the potential consequences.
Yeah, of course.
Even seemingly small changes can have unintended effects.
Right.
So it's crucial to be mindful of that.
So open source offers more control,
It does.
But it also demands more responsibility.
Exactly. You have the freedom to experiment and innovate, but you also have the responsibility to do so ethically.
Yeah.
And with a really clear understanding of the potential impact.
That makes sense. But what about control with closed source models then? Are we just along for the ride?
To a larger degree, yes.
Okay.
With closed source models, we kind of have to trust the developers to have built a system that is safe. That's unbiased, that's reliable. We're really relying on their expertise and their judgment.
So it's like choosing a restaurant based on its reputation.
Yeah.
Hoping that the chef knows what they're doing.
That's a good way to think about it. We're trusting the brand.
Yeah.
And their commitment to quality. And that's why it's so important to really carefully research.
Yeah.
And select closed source models from companies that have a really solid track record.
Right. So due diligence is key.
Exactly.
We need to be informed consumers, even when it comes to AI.
Absolutely.
Here's a question that's been on my mind. We've talked about the pros and cons, the ethics, the control aspects. What about performance?
Okay.
Can open source models really compete with those backed by giant corporations?
That's a great question. And you know what?
What?
Increasingly, the answer is yes.
Wow. Really?
It might be surprising, but research has actually shown that in certain areas, open source models are outperforming their closed source counterparts.
That's impressive. I guess that shows the power of collaboration and ingenuity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really challenges that assumption that bigger always means better.
Yeah.
Open source developers are coming up with these creative solutions and pushing the boundaries of what's possible, even with limited resources.
So it's not always a David versus Goliath situation?
Not anymore. In some areas, it's more like a level playing field, which is incredibly exciting.
That's fantastic news for innovation. It means we're not stuck with this one-size-fits-all approach. But let's be honest, there are still some areas where closed source models have the upper hand, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
When it comes to tasks that require really massive amounts of data or specialized hardware, closed source models with that big corporate backing often have a significant advantage.
Right.
Think about things like image recognition
Yeah.
or complex simulations.
Okay.
Those things require huge data sets
Yeah.
and tons of powerful computing infrastructure, which might be hard for smaller independent teams to access.
So it's not a complete victory for open source just yet?
Not yet.
The playing field might be leveling in some areas, but resources still matter in others.
Yeah. It's a complex landscape. Both open and closed source models bring their own strengths and weaknesses.
It's almost like a constantly evolving ecosystem.
Yeah.
With all these different species of AI.
I like that.
Competing and collaborating in all these fascinating ways.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It highlights the fact that we need both open and closed source models
Okay.
if we want to see continued progress in the field.
Because ultimately it's about finding the right tool for the job, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes an open source model will be the perfect fit.
Right.
And other times a closed source model will be the better choice.
It's all about having the right tool for the job. And as users, we have that responsibility to stay informed
Yeah.
about the different options and understand the implications of our choices.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. There's still so much more to explore. What are your thoughts on where this whole open source versus closed source debate is headed in the future?
That's a great question. Honestly, I think we're going to see even more blurring of the lines between the two approaches.
Okay.
Hybrid models that combine elements of both are already starting to emerge.
Oh, interesting.
And I think those will become even more common.
So a blending of the best of both worlds.
Exactly. And, it's even possible that completely new paradigms of AI development will emerge.
Wow.
Things that challenge our current understanding of open versus closed.
Yeah.
The field is evolving so rapidly, it's almost impossible to predict what the future holds.
That's both incredibly exciting and a little daunting.
It is.
But it makes this whole conversation even more relevant.
Oh, absolutely.
We need to understand where we are now to be prepared for whatever comes next.
Yes, 100%. It's like we're trying to navigate uncharted territory here.
Yeah.
We need a really good map and a keen sense of direction to make the right choices.
Speaking of maps and directions, I think we're ready to move on to part 3 of our deep dive. There's something that's been on my mind, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So we've covered the tech, the performance, the ethics, but what about the economics of all this?
Yeah.
How does choosing between open and closed source actually impact the business side of AI? It feels like there's a whole other layer to this conversation we haven't even touched yet.
You're right. The economic models behind AI development are hugely important.
Yeah.
I mean, they really shape the entire landscape.
Okay.
It influences what gets created, who has access to it, and ultimately how it's used.
So break it down for me. What are some of these key economic forces at play?
Well, one of the biggest trends is the rise of these proprietary AI platforms.
Okay.
You know, the ones often offered by those giant tech companies we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
They basically package pre-trained models and tools and all that to make it super easy for businesses to just integrate AI into what they're already doing.
Sounds pretty convenient, but I'm guessing it's not free, right?
There's often a catch. These platforms typically come with, pretty hefty subscription fees.
Ah, okay.
And the customization options can be limited.
Right.
So you're paying for the convenience.
Yeah.
And you're paying for access to their expertise.
Okay, so you're trading flexibility and control for ease of use and support.
To a certain extent, yeah.
Yeah.
And this model has sparked a lot of debate, actually.
Well, yeah.
Some people argue that it creates a barrier for smaller companies.
Okay.
Or even independent developers.
Makes sense.
They just might not have the resources to compete with these massive platforms.
It's like the big players are building this toll road to AI.
Yeah.
And not everyone can afford the price of admission. Does that, stifle innovation in the long run?
It's definitely a valid concern.
Yeah.
If only a small number of companies control access to the best and most powerful AI tools, it could really limit the diversity of ideas and applications that emerge.
That makes sense. But aren't these companies also investing a ton in research and development? I mean, they're pushing the boundaries of what's possible, right? Doesn't everyone benefit from that eventually?
You're absolutely right. Their contributions are significant for sure.
Yeah.
And the scale at which they operate allows for these breakthroughs.
Right.
That would be really tough for smaller groups to achieve.
Yeah.
But it's about finding that balance.
Okay.
We need a good mix. Corporate-driven innovation and community-driven development.
Yeah.
That's how you create a healthy AI ecosystem.
So it's not either. We need both the big players and the independent innovators to move things forward.
That's exactly right. And that's where the open source movement plays such a vital role.
Okay.
It provides an alternative pathway.
Right.
A space where collaboration and shared knowledge can really fuel innovation.
Yeah.
Outside of those traditional corporate structures.
It's like having a public park alongside those impressive but exclusive private gardens.
Oh, I like that.
Both have their value, right? And both contribute to the beauty of the overall landscape.
That perfectly captures what we're aiming for. A diverse and inclusive AI ecosystem where all these different approaches can exist and thrive together.
This has been a super insightful conversation.
It has.
I feel like we went way beyond just comparing open and closed source.
Right.
We touched on the ethics, the impact on innovation, and now even the economic forces that are shaping this whole landscape.
It's all connected, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
The choices we make about AI technology are tied to these bigger questions about values and access,
Yeah.
about the future we're building.
And those are questions that we all need to be thinking about as individuals and as a society.
Couldn't agree more. The future of AI isn't something that's just happening to us.
Right.
We're actively shaping it,
Yeah.
through our decisions, the conversations we have, the actions we take.
Well, you've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
I hope so.
This deep dive has been packed with insights.
I agree.
To all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this exploration. We hope you've learned something new about LLMs.
Yeah.
And maybe you're even a little inspired to keep learning.
I hope so.
This field is so fascinating.
It really is.
And it's constantly evolving.
Remember, the future of AI is in our hands.
That's right.
Let's shape it wisely.
That's a great point. That's a perfect note to end on. Until next time, happy diving, everyone.